Japanese how to make whiskey.
What do you, is that Japanese whiskey?
Yeah. I used to work as was in Ireland it's called an orderly in a hospital, psychiatric hospital. And I saw how when the residents, or inmates as we would call them, prisoners really, when their parents or their guardians would visit at the weekends, they loved these people, but also they behaved as if having a desire for intimacy or having a desire for sex or having a desire for human engagement was somehow a deviation based on their diagnosis rather than a human desire. And I remember at the time thinking I'd love to make something about that. And the second thing was I was homeless when I was a teenager for about a year and a half, and I remember feeling like a ghost in my own life and realizing that I was in violent situations, I was in crazy situations, but none of them frightened me as much as being lonely. So I wanted to somehow find a way of using a film to explore those two experiences. I think we're all mentally ill on some level. I think the phrase mental illness has become a kind of con. So we use it, certain people use it to control other people. But in general, the idea of electroconvulsive therapy, the idea of restarting, it's like rebooting a computer, or it's like smashing something against a wall to see if it will restart. That's what austerity is. That's what governments across Europe are starting to employ. And like anything, even a stop clock is right twice a day. You can have occasional incidences where people feel this is incredible, this is what I need, this is better than anything that has preceded it. But in general, I think we're all living in a kind of electroconvulsive culture. And I think the long-term damage is beyond comprehension, and the short-term benefit is a lie. So I'm not trying to negate anybody's experiences of it, but as a metaphor, as a political metaphor, I think we are living in a realm of the ugliest doctors creating in us the worst kind of Frankensteins and claiming that somehow it's beneficial to all of us, when in fact we're creating a subhuman culture of disenfranchised, disempowered, broken people. If the dictionary definition of love describes a mental breakdown in a dispassionate, non-emotive way, that's a kind of psychiatric evaluation. But precisely what it describes is exactly what happens to all of us when we fall in love. We lose all control of self, we lose all capacity for objective thought, we lose all capacity for independence, and we become so desperately hooked on a notion larger than us to such a degree that we're willing to sacrifice everything for it. If that's not love, and if that's not a mental breakdown at the same time, then I don't know what the hell is. Because to be in love, to find that connection with somebody to such a degree that you're willing to put everything on the line, willing to lose everything just to taste them, just to touch them, just to kiss them, just to engage with them, that's the best kind of mental illness there is.
There's something about it that really touches people. You know, like I think there's a kind of a quality. To me, it was always a kind of a love story anyway. So I think the love story is really powerful. Mm-hmm. And I also think, though, that there's practically nobody that you'll meet anywhere in the world, as far as I can figure out, who hasn't in some shape or form, whether it's a brother, a sister, a cousin, a mother, a father, you know, had mental health issues, you know, been damaged and vulnerable, and found themselves, you know, coming up against forces that they can't control. So that's really what it's about for me.
It's funny because having a political response to something, you can't tell an audience what to feel. You can't tell an audience what to think, nor should you ever try. But your motivation for making a film, I think, has to be necessarily political. even creating comedy, even creating a love story, even creating the things that we deem to be throwaway irrelevances are still a political statement, because you're saying that another world is possible. Patrick's Day is born out of a desire, an insistence to find a better way of addressing the most vulnerable in our society, who are controlled and destroyed by the worst in our society.
Well, I met Terry at a very, very small film festival in up near the Northern Irish border, and we just got chatting about stuff, and he had a film in it, Charlie Casanova in fact, and I had a film in it called A Kiss for Jed, which I'd just made in New York, which I actually thought was sort of crap, but anyway, I think he thought it was crap too. But anyway, so then he gave me a copy of his film, and I went home, watched it, and thought, wow, this is really interesting. Like, it had this one quality which I really, really look for in films, which is that I had absolutely no idea. It's not, you know, not all the time, but there were scenes where I'm kind of going, what the fuck is going to happen now? And then I showed it to my son, and I was kind of like saying, oh, listen, come and have a look at this, Sam. You know, just watch 10 minutes of it. Just tell me if this is complete, you know, crap, or what do you think of it? And then, you know, we found ourselves 2 hours later still watching it, and the same thing then happened again a few days later with a friend of mine, exactly the same thing. So now I'd watched it 3 times. I also had about 5 of his scripts, which I read, like, really quickly. Now, I never do that. I hate reading other people's scripts. I mean, I've read millions of them, but I don't like it. But actually, they were all so interesting. And so I basically thought about, then we were off, there was another film that I thought we should do called Oliver Twisted. And we actually worked together for a while on that in we went to a kind of like thing that the Irish Film Board had set up, which is kind of like a sort of you know, workshop. And we worked on that, and just really enjoyed working together. And then, and I kind of like, I'd read Patrick's Day, and I kind of thought, I just didn't quite see how it could get made. And then we were coming back from Galway Film Festival, and suddenly it just clicked into place in my head. I just suddenly thought, oh yeah, actually. And then we just decided to make it. And here's what was really interesting about it, because like, I had no idea how much money we could raise for it at that stage. But it was literally a decision that we would get however much money we had, and if, like, in 3 months' time we had 10,000 euros, we'd make the film for 10,000 euros. And I mean, we didn't. We got a lot, you know, got more money and got a decent budget and all the rest of it, and you know, the whole production values were consequently higher. But the actual decision to make the film was actually taken that day in the car. So it wasn't like psychologically you were thinking, well, I'll make it if, you know, somebody else will give us the money. We were just going to make it.
I made one film before Patrick's Day. Even that phrase is horrible. A whole bunch of people make a movie. When directors say, I made a film, it's such an arrogant thing to say. It's nonsense. But I ended up in an act of complete desperation. And I have no interest in betting on horses. I have no interest in gambling. It doesn't excite me at all. But bookies or gambling houses were one of the few places you could go that were warm, and you could hang around for several hours and nobody would question you, because you're just watching the television and everybody is immersed in their obsession. So I got some betting slips, and the front of a betting slip is the breakdown of the races for the day, but the back of the betting slip is blank. And they have pencils, and all the pencils are sharp so that you can write. And I started to, out of complete desperation, try to write a sentence. And that sentence became a paragraph, and that paragraph became the beginning of a screenplay. And I didn't have any formal education. I didn't have any of the prerequisites to even begin to conceive of the notion that you have the right to think of making films. I never thought I would ever make a film, ever. But I also knew that words on a page can't be faked. Words on a page can't be lied about or stolen, or I don't want to use foul language, so I'll try and keep it polite. But I knew that the most transparent thing you can do in terms of language is put words on a page. And the reader is either moved or they're not. If they're not moved, it's your failure. If they are moved, then it's their experience. And from that, I wrote a screenplay. And that screenplay, bizarrely and perversely and weirdly, ended up being given to somebody who gave it to somebody else. And that somebody else read it, and I got a call. I was living in this tiny little box, flat, apartment, whatever you call it in French, but we were living on the dole, on welfare. We had a new baby, we had all those things. And this guy was a professor in America. And he was a professor of literature. But he was also a producer of films. And he had read the screenplay, and he was very, very excited by the screenplay because he was obsessed with two writers, James Joyce and Charles Bukowski. And I knew very little about Joyce, but I listened to him quote Joyce and listened to him quote Eliot and listened to him quote everybody. And he was one of those extraordinary people who could quote all the great poets and all the great poems. But he asked me, had I ever read Bukowski's piece on writing? It's called On Writing. And by sheer absurd coincidence, On Writing was in front of me on a book. And I read the book over the phone, read the poem as if I knew it. It was a little bit disingenuous, but I also didn't reveal. He thought I had remembered it off the top of my head. It was the only poem he asked me about. It was an incredible 1,000,000,000 shot that it was there in front of me. And I read it as if I was quoting it. And he got such a excited response to it that he asked me would I write a screenplay for his client, who was Daryl Hannah, the movie star Daryl Hannah. And I ended up being flown first class to Los Angeles, and I spent a few weeks writing a screenplay for Daryl Hannah. So you go from abject poverty on welfare to first class flight to Daryl Hannah's house for a few weeks to returning to that world. But I got paid $25,000, which was the biggest amount of money I'd ever encountered. And that $25,000 was the beginning of an attempt to change your position in your world, to begin to believe that you might perhaps have something to write about or something to say. And that progressed into, hopefully, trying to make a film. And that film became a film called Charlie Casanova, which was one of the most hated films ever made. So maybe I should have stayed in that flat.
I want to die, not in my home bed.